Yeah, I've been following worker co-ops, especially in places like Baltimore, where I'm based, and around the country for a couple years now. And it's really fascinating to see what can happen when workers, are the owners, and that's how worker co-ops operate. Workers are the owners; they run the business democratically. And so I wanted to sort of compare how they operated during the pandemic versus how Amazon operated when you had thousands of people getting sick in warehouses. You had efforts to unionize that were being crushed down in Bessemer, Alabama. And yeah, so I thought that would be really fascinating. How do businesses where the workers vote democratically choose profits versus safety? And worker co-ops show that it's possible to run a successful business, weather the pandemic, and in a lot of cases still be profitable and not have to compromise their core values and still provide often essential services. I spoke to home care workers. I spoke to food cooperatives, businesses that were on the front line of the pandemic, and they managed to make their workers' jobs not hell during this awful time.
How did they compare to small businesses? Because there's nobody more lionized in American politics than small business owners. But if you've ever actually worked for a small business owner, often you find them to be little tiny tyrants. A monopoly is made up not just on size, but on competition. And so some of these small businesses, have absolutely no competition. They're, say, the only store in a small town. And if there's not a cooperative model there, they can kind of do whatever they want to their employees because they have so much hiring power. Did you compare them to comparatively sized businesses as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the most interesting things to come out of what I learned through this reporting is because so there's a lot of restaurants, there's a lot of businesses. So the average co-op has about 10 workers. So that is the size of a small business. And yeah, and like you said, small business owners are lionized, and and so when you saw the headlines of people owners not being able to find work, that sort of kind of really struck me. But instead of a business owner, even a small business owner, taking the majority share of the profit, in a co-op, the profit is split often equally, and oftentimes even the non-owners get a share of the profit too. When the decisions are made democratically, you have to work together. It gives a sense of ownership to the workers.
Women are tools to advance his own power and interests. And I can tell you that if he finds a woman attractive and he has control over her schedule, meaning she works for him and she interacts with him regularly, then they have faced this kind of abuse. That's how pervasive it is. That's how destructive it is. And that's how wrong it is. So, when I came forward, I had to do it knowing that I may be the only one. But on some level, the fact that so many women have come forward, despite the fact that he's so powerful, shows how pervasive this abuse is. I mean, I was just trying to think of women who I maybe had overlapped with, and I said, would he find them attractive in all likelihood? Or are they, someone that he would be attracted to? And did they work for him? And I zeroed in on women who had, been harassed by him. I mean, it was that pervasive. And think about how damaging that is. I mean, for women in society, and it's consistent with his MO. I mean, to prevent a progressive woman from beating him in the governor's race, he created a women's equality party, which has nothing to do with women's equality. To prevent coverage of his nursing home death scandal, he offered and how he benefited from it in a $5 million fee for publishing. He did a $5 million lottery for people to get vaccinated. I mean, it's all about obfuscation. It's all about self-dealing. He is all about enriching his own power, and he will use whatever avenue to do that. And I think one thing that I think is very redeeming is it's a group of women who have had everything to lose who are saying no more. It's not these leaders at a national level who have pushed on this. It's not our Carl Hastie. I do think Andrea Stewart Cousins has been a good leader on this on the whole. And it's young women even in the legislature, like Alessandra Biaggi, Yulene New, Julia Salazar, who have than most on the front lines, Gustavo Rivera as well, supporting us, and Ron Kim, of course. I mean, first and foremost. I think it's showing a lot of leadership from our current elected to say, I don't want to live this way. And a lot of this abuse and toxicity and corruption is symptomatic of everything wrong with New York's politics.
Where we have a united Democratic government, a Democrat in the White House, a Democratic House, and a Democratic Senate, the villain has to be somewhat diversified so that Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, two of the most conservative Democrats in the Senate, have been singled out as obstructing all of the good legislation that Democrats would otherwise pass. However, what this article, this reporting reveals is that the depth of disagreement among Democrats, the depth to which there are more than just two Democrats who aren't on board with an agenda that frankly reflects the interest of a bipartisan majority of Americans, goes a lot deeper than just Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. And the extent to which Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin have been put out there by the Democratic Party to take all of the heat for Joe Biden not passing this kind of progressive legislation, it's really all a bit of a cloak and dagger that covers the extent to which we have two corporate parties, neither of which is especially invested in doing the things that Americans want them to do.
I was just going to ask you on that point exactly. Do you believe that establishment Democrats are essentially using Manchin and Sinema as cover to sort of get away behind the scenes without taking that fire themselves, with pushing back on some of the more progressive elements that are being suggested? But what some establishment Democrats are essentially doing, I mean, you work in politics, you work in Democratic politics, you know these people. Is that what they're doing here? They're just using Manchin and Sinema as cover?
Absolutely. I mean, the reporting here was pretty explicit, but we've been making that argument, for example, over at Bad Faith Podcast for a long time now. And you saw it in machinations like those around the $15 minimum wage. The way that issue was reported was a straightforward, oh, well, we don't have the votes for it. The conservative Democrats refused to vote for it. And of course, we can't get 10 Republicans on board either. But when you look more closely at procedurally how it played out, what happened was there was an objection from conservative Democrats. But at the end of the day, Chuck Schumer chose to take the $15 minimum wage out of the bill preemptively, so that there was never actually an up-down vote that the senators would have to stand behind and defend to their constituents. The vote that was taken was on whether or not to reintroduce a $15 minimum wage back into the COVID relief bill, which would have required 60 votes, unlike the original up-down vote, which would have only taken 50 plus one, the tiebreaker vote, which of course the Democrats have. So again, you see one of these machinations where all of the procedural issues, talking about the parliamentarian, all of that conversation is used to disguise the extent to which Joe Biden and the Democrats could act if they wanted to, not even getting into the extent to which there are a number of things that Joe Biden could do by executive order, which he has said he doesn't want to do on principle. What that principle is beyond me.